Hi there. In this video lecture, we'll be talking about the Civil War. You may have heard of it. It's not too much of a stretch to say that the Civil War is the axis on which American history revolves, so much so that it has frequently been enticing to view the conflict in biblical terms. In his second inaugural speech, President Lincoln, you can see him right here, spoke of the war as the means by which America might cleanse the stain of its original sin, slavery, from its body politic. And that view has retained its power for many in the intervening decades. Historians have sometimes viewed the war in just those terms, especially in moments when historians doubted the wisdom of ending slavery, that this moralizing view of the war took a decided back seat. Although the motivation for these alternate theories was at times suspect or even racist, it also led historians to try to view the war through the eyes of the people who actually lived through it, which is something that I hope we will always do. We'll be looking at three different aspects of the war. First, its cause; second, its outcome; and third, the question of how and why enslaved people achieved their freedom. If you went to an American high school, you are probably familiar with the old either-or argument about what caused the Civil War: slavery or states' rights. We'll have occasion to think about that argument, but I'd like to offer you a little context for it. Historians didn't start to argue that the war was fought over states' rights until about 35 years after the war. Prior to that, from the end of the war all the way to around 1900 or so, pretty much everyone agreed that the war took place because Southerners wanted slavery to expand and Northerners wanted to stop its expansion. It was not until the absolute height of the Jim Crow era, around the turn of the century, when many whites were arguing that African Americans didn't deserve citizenship or even freedom, historians jumped on that bandwagon and came up with a new justification for the war that made slavery into a more benign institution. Their motives at the time were almost purely racist. But the idea they came up with was at least somewhat ingenious, and what is more, they used methods, or at least took a wide view of things, in a way that has had a lasting impact on the way people think about the Civil War. This has not all been for the worse. Their racist sense that no sane person could have sincerely cared about the fortunes of quote-unquote savage African Americans. Remember, at this point, some of the debates over the motives that abolitionists had led them to evaluate the wider social and economic developments surrounding the war. In doing so, they noted that the war ushered in a new economic era in which Northern industrialists dominated the economy as thoroughly as Southern cotton planters had done previously. So they advanced the notion that Northern industrialists used the war, or even encouraged the war, in order to impose their values and economy on traditional Southern institutions. You can see there the kernel of the states' rights argument, arguing that Southern states had their own institutions and that the national government, controlled by rich industrialists in this story, used the war to make those states give up their traditional way of life and get with the new economic program. Since the 1960s, once again since the Civil Rights Movement, which, if you've been following our course, you've seen had a transformative effect on the way that many historians viewed American history. Scholars have re-examined the motives of those Jim Crow-era historians and found that they willfully manipulated and sometimes ignored evidence to fit their own racist theories. Historians have also re-examined the ways that Northerners and Southerners were talking about the war as it approached, and have found a whole lot of discussion about slavery, and comparatively very little discussion about states' rights, much less discussion about industrialism. The question of what these particular men here in this picture were fighting for is particularly relevant. This image shows the massacre at Fort Pillow, in which Confederate soldiers under the direction of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who would later gain fame as the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, brutally murdered African American Union troops after they surrendered. Did they do this just because they were displeased by the approach of industrialism? I sort of doubt it. Still, the consideration of the war's role in economic change has remained a valuable vestige of a more racist theory. So think as you read and study about the reasons that these people would fight each other. What would have caused them to risk all the benefits and glory that someone like Daniel Webster might have mentioned in his 7th of March speech that pertained to being an American citizen, that pertained to keeping the Union intact? And what did that risk yield? Historians are in the midst of another debate over the war, not just about its causes, and I'm not sure that this debate will ever end. Historians are wondering why the Union won. One side of this argument suggests that the Union won because of its unstoppable industrial war machine. The South had superior military leadership, this theory goes. Everyone stops here to point to Confederate General Robert E. Lee, but the North's industrial firepower was just too much to overcome. Now, this map gives you some sort of indication of that. If you look right here, you can see just an incredible corridor of industrial strength as represented by the growth of railroads there. On the other hand, by comparison, the South was comparatively very little industrialized, having put much of their energy and effort into building up their cotton economy, which required less industrial strength. And if you think about it, you can see how this argument might relate to the old states' rights argument. The South, in this view, had the nobility of spirit, but the North's industrial leaders, the ones who apparently wanted the war in the first place, knew that their victory was inevitable. But other historians have looked at the war not just from the perspective of firepower, but from the perspective of tactical and strategic choices that leaders made on and away from the battlefield. There, historians have found, to the surprise of some who genuflect at the altar of Robert E. Lee, some significant advantages in Northern leadership over Southern. Specifically, historians have found that the Union General Ulysses S. Grant, and especially Abraham Lincoln, developed enormously as leaders in the war, while Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, made numerous strategic blunders as the war advanced. Some historians have even noted that Robert E. Lee himself screwed up in spots, costing the South perhaps its advantage at Gettysburg. Other historians have argued that neither side can truly be said to have had an advantage, and that much of the war came down to contingency. If Lee had had better intelligence from his subordinates at Gettysburg, for instance, the entire war might have gone differently. The freeing of the slaves and everything else came down, and you might argue, to an hour or two on the battlefield. These are difficult questions to answer, and I admit, especially difficult without access to extensive battlefield archives, but I encourage you to engage them nonetheless. Finally, there's the question of slavery. Probably the only truism in American history older than Lincoln freed the slaves is Columbus discovered America. But again, since the Civil Rights Movement, historians have taken a closer look at how enslaved African Americans were behaving during the Civil War, and they have come up with a revolutionary theory. During the Civil War, they argue, and seeing the opportunity that the Civil War gave them, slaves freed themselves. Now that may sound just like a change in emphasis, and it smacks of political correctness to some. But keep in mind that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't take effect until January 1st, 1863, and that some African Americans consistently left their plantations as soon as Union troops neared, all through 1861 and 1862. Someone was freeing the slaves during the first 2 years of the war, and it wasn't Abraham Lincoln. What's more, think about what a change this single switch in emphasis yields. If you focus on their being freed, you get a story of potentially helpless slaves who couldn't do for themselves. This was in some ways the more sympathetic twin brother of the early 20th century racist view that slaves didn't benefit from being freed. But if enslaved people freed themselves, not only does this change the way that African Americans themselves might be viewed, suddenly they become at the very least heroes of their own lives, it also potentially overturns the entire narrative of the war. Whatever the war was fought for, there is little denying that the South's economy depended on the prosperity of the slave economy. So if African Americans freed themselves from slavery, they played a determinative role in ending the war, not only by crippling the Southern economy, but by rushing to the Union lines and volunteering to be soldiers. What's more, the way that Union leaders discussed runaway slaves, frequently described as contraband, suggests that the black push for freedom did more than Northern leaders actually intended or hoped, at least at first, and that the actions of slaves thus drove the policy of the war, rather than being driven by it, and in fact were the deciding factor in Northern victory. So you can see from these three debates not only how open the Civil War remains for analysis, but how deep the ramifications of that analysis are. On your choices and on your readings of evidence, the whole history of the American people and the American nation turns.